Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. Today I want to talk about my year of reading Russians. In 2021, I decided that I would have a reading theme for every year. Now, it doesn't mean that I read exclusively from my theme for the year, but it does mean that I read predominantly from the theme. So my theme for 2021 was Proust. So I read In Search of Lost Time, and I also read some Proust adjacent literature. That worked so well and I got so much out of it that I decided to keep doing an annual theme for every year. So in 2022, my reading theme for the year was a year of reading Russians. Now, I'm actually quite poorly read when it comes to Russian classics. The only Russian classic I had read before this year was Anna Karenina, and I read that in the Moore translation. So aside from that, I hadn't read any of the major 19th century Russian classical works. So this year is very much about getting through that Russian 101 reading list of the major works of the major Russian authors from the 19th century. So I want to talk a little bit about the books I have read this year, what I didn't get to, and what will be the reading theme for next year. I want to start off first with War and Peace. Now, War and Peace, I read pretty much January and February this year. And I thought I'd start with it because in many ways, it typifies the major epic Russian novel. It is long, it is historic, it has a wide cast of characters that are absolutely a nightmare to keep track of. But quite apart from all of that, it is absolutely wonderful. People who have read both Anna Karenina and War and Peace have their own favorite out of the two. For me, it's very much War and Peace, although I haven't read Anna Karenina now for probably about a decade. So maybe it's time to update my recollection of Anna Karenina as well to work out which one I actually prefer out of the two. But at the moment, I do prefer War and Peace. I just find it absolutely astounding in terms of the sheer scale and ambition of it. I even didn't mind the second epilogue where Tolstoy is basically just going on about his theory of history rather than telling anything with a plot in it. My experience of reading War and Peace was also in some ways amplified by the increasing rhetoric in January and February this year from Russia about invading Ukraine. And in fact, a few days after I finished this book, Russia did go and invade Ukraine. And so I had this strange experience of getting to the end of War and Peace and reading all of Tolstoy's theory on historical determinism and how the actions of individuals are all inevitable because we're all just these cogs in the wheel of time and history. But also looking at the modern day, I suppose, parallel of that, where Putin's rhetoric around why he has to invade Ukraine was also ramping up. And I don't know that I came to the end of it agreeing with Tolstoy. I don't know that I agree that it was inevitable that Russia invaded Ukraine. In fact, I think this was a calculated decision made by one person and that person's regime. But it does go to the continuing relevance of this book in the modern day era, even where we may not have the scale of war that we had during the Napoleonic times or even during World War I and II. War is nevertheless a fact of life, and it's a fact of life for the people in Ukraine. It's a fact of life for all the people in the neighboring countries, and it's a fact of life elsewhere in the world where we may not be paying as much attention to the internal and external conflicts between certain countries. So I absolutely loved the experience of reading this book. There are scenes in it that would stay with me for a long, long time. One of my favorite scenes in it is the hunting scene where after Natasha and Nikolai go for the hunt with their uncle, they go back to the lodge and she does this dance, and it was like she danced the Russianness out of her, and to me that was just such a memorable scene that even to this day, about a full year after I finished this book, I I still have a lot of fond memories for kind of those beautiful moments in this book that will stay with me for a long, long time. The next book I read in my year of reading Russians is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, I liked Crime and Punishment, but I think it's fair to say that of all the Russian classics I read this year, it's my least favorite. There are things that I liked about it. I liked the psychological thriller aspect of it. I liked the fact that the book really explores the internal mental and moral anguish of the main character, Raskolnikov, who, if you didn't know the plot, planned to kill an old woman who was a pawnbroker. And he sort of convinces himself that he had to do it, that it was for the good of society that he needed to kill this old woman, because she was not of value to society in the way that he was, for example. After the deed was done, his mental anguish and disgust over his own actions sort of slowly begin to eat away at him. And the book does a wonderful job of keeping you within the claustrophobic mindset of this individual and how he came to convince himself to do this deed and what happens and how he dealt with the consequences of that deed. As I said, I liked the book. I didn't love it. And in particular, I had a bit of a problem with the character of Sonia, who I just didn't find to be convincing at all as a character. And in some ways, she, as the main female character in the book, she was too good. And because she was too good, she was just also completely unremarkable and boring. And of all of the Russian books I read this year, I think she's probably one of the most poorly crafted female characters in the book. But that said, I am actually looking forward to reading a few more books from Dostoevsky in the future. I really want to read Brothers Karamazov, and also some of his shorter fiction as well, like the Idiot. But I think Crime and Punishment is not going to be a favorite of mine, even though overall it was an enjoyable, worthwhile book and there was a lot in it. The next book I read was Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. I really had hoped I would like this book. And in some ways, I feel like I really do. But for the fact that the translation that I have is terrible. So this, for those who don't know, this is the Heron edition of hardbacks, which I have quite a few. They're quite old and they have a horrible musty smell to them, which I know some people like, but I do not, because it's mold and we should not be breathing in mold into our bodies. But that aside, I generally quite like these hardbacks, but the translations are a bit hit and miss. So this particular translation is by Avril Pyman and W.R.S. Ralston. And it's an old translation and it's somewhat very, very clunky. Quite a few times when I'm reading through the book, it felt like the translator was getting in the way of the author and really affecting my reading experience. For those who don't know, Fathers and Sons is the story of Bazarov, who is a student who comes home with his friend Arkady Kirsanov, and the two of them go to the estate of Kirsanov's father. And because Bazarov is such a strangely aloof and nihilistic character, it causes a bit of friction between the fathers and the sons in this particular book. The book itself is, the plot is fabulous. The progression of the characters, both kind of when they were at the estate, but also when they leave and travel to different people's houses, and the characters, particularly the female characters that they meet along the way. I thought the book was fabulous, but again, the translation really affected my experience of reading it, so I can't say that it was an absolute favorite this year. The final scene of the book was a bit of a gut punch. It was strangely moving, but also in the most weirdly sentimental way. I can't really describe it, but I really was quite touched by the ending of this book. Overall, I would recommend it. I really think that I need to give this book a second read, but in a different translation to do it any justice. One of the things that I learned about reading Russians this year is that translations really do matter. And so in some of these older translations that you've got, the quality of writing really varies. And so whereas this one I really didn't think was very good, there have been some other older translations that I absolutely adored. On the note of older translations that I love, this year I read the first volume of a collected 2-volume set of Chekhov's short stories. So again, this is the Heron edition of these hardbacks. I have quite a few of these which I've picked up in secondhand bookstores over the years. I'm not sure if it's an Australian publisher or whatnot, but I tend to find these a lot in secondhand bookshops in Australia. And so this edition of Chekhov's short stories was translated by Constance Garnett. Constance Garnett seems to have not a great reputation among Russian translators. And I can't quite figure out why, because I find her translations quite good. They are lyrical, they're slightly old-fashioned, but in a kind of Edwardian sense. Not in the sense of it being very heavy or clunky. And as far as I can tell, a lot of the objections to her seem to have come from Nabokov, who thought that she made all of the Russian writers sound the same. I disagree, but having said that, I really did enjoy her translation of Chekhov's short stories. My favorite of the short stories is actually the first one in this particular volume, which is The Lady with the Little Dog. The Lady with the Dog. This is one of Chekhov's most famous short stories, and it's about an affair that occurs between a man and a woman who meet in Yalta. And as the story progresses, you realize that the affair, which they had initially dismissed as a holiday fling, was a little bit more than that. The writing was absolutely wonderful. The characters were so alive, and the fact that these two characters slowly come to the realization that they love each other. But then I won't disclose the ending, but let's just say that Chekhov leaves a fair amount of ambiguity in the development and the resolution of the plot. And I just think it takes so much restraint and also work to be able to craft a story that feels complete, but also leaving that space for ambiguity at the same time. And the final book that I am currently still reading for my year of reading Russians is a collection of Chekhov's plays. This is the Franklin Library edition of Chekhov's plays. There's 4 plays in this particular volume, and they are The Cherry Orchard, The Seagull, The Three Sisters, and Uncle Vanya. And the translator is Elizaveta Fenn. I love these. I'm on to the second play, which is The Seagull. And the first play I read was The Cherry Orchard, which was the story of an aristocratic female landowner who returns to her traditional family estate where there was a cherry orchard, and she's lost all of her money. She cannot go on, and so the estate must be auctioned off to sort of continue to feed her and her family, and to sustain the rest of the family going forward. And even though there were sort of multiple ways in which she could have saved the estate, she could have saved the cherry orchard, she was so paralyzed by her traditional notions of social order and propriety that she's just simply unable to do it. And so part of this play was a really interesting look at the social upheaval that's being caused by the liberation of the serfs and the emergence of a middle class in Russia, a bourgeoisie of sorts. And kind of the losing grip on power by the Russian aristocrats. And so it's a really interesting kind of social insight into Russia at the end of the 19th century. I really enjoyed it. I am still reading through some of the other plays in this particular volume, but I think it's fair to say that Chekhov is probably going to be one of my favorite Russian writers, and I absolutely am currently having a blast reading through these plays. I want to talk a little bit now about the books that I didn't get to this year. So firstly, I didn't get to volume 2 of Chekhov's short stories, so I'm actually really happy about this. I sort of saved a little bit more of these wonderful stories for next year or the year after. The second book that I had wanted to read this year that I didn't get around to reading is a different translation of Anna Karenina. So this is the Penguin Deluxe editions with the French flaps and the deckled edges. It's not a particularly attractive cover for Anna Karenina, but apparently this is one of the most popular translations on the market at the moment, which is by Richard Pavia and Larissa Volokonsky. They're a husband and wife duo who translates a lot of Russian literature. In fact, I think my War and Peace copy was translated by them, which I quite enjoyed, apart from the fact that they made a decision not to translate the French in that volume. But aside from that, I really heard a lot of good things about their translation of Anna Karenina. So I had wanted to read it because I had previously read Anna Karenina in the Mold translation, but I didn't get around to it. So I think that I'll save this possibly not for next year, but the year after. One of the other books I didn't get to this year, which I think I will read next year, is Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. So this book has quite an epic history, apparently. It had to be smuggled out of Russia. At one point it was distributed by the CIA, but it's now become an absolute Soviet classic. So I've heard really good things about it. I suspect we're going to get along. I am absolutely looking forward to reading this book. I should also say I have quite a few editions of this wonderful vintage Russian collection, and they have amazing inside covers based on printed Russian fabrics, and they are absolutely wonderful. If you're looking for lovely editions of Russian classics, I highly recommend these. And I think there's about 5 or 6 in the set. I don't have the whole set, but I have 4 of them, and I absolutely love them. The last book that I had wanted to read this year, but I didn't get to, is Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. And again, I have it in this lovely vintage Russian series with the beautiful print from Russian textiles on the inside cover. Apparently this book is sort of that 20th century Russian epic in the vein of War and Peace. And if War and Peace is kind of the benchmark of Russian novels, and this book is being compared to War and Peace, I suspect we're going to get along just fine. So I'm looking forward to reading this, and I'm pretty sure I'll get around to doing it next year. So that's my year of reading Russians. I've been so blessed this year to have had access to such wonderful books from this powerhouse country in world literature, and I'm so happy with my theme that I picked for the year. In 2023, I've picked a theme for the year based on the most number of unread books I have that can be grouped into a particular theme. And so the theme for 2023 will be a year of reading Victorian literature. I have read very little of Victorian novels. The only ones that I think I have read are sort of your Bronte sisters, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. So I think I have a lot of books on this particular bookshelf that are unread from the Victorian era, which will make fabulous reading for a whole year. So I will do a future video about what those books are and what I hope to read next year. But until then, thanks for watching.